surgery residents. Even if the animals survive these operations, they are killed immediately afterwards. It's deeply troubling that in 2025, such archaic and cruel practices continue to persist. This abuse comes at a time when nearly 80% of surveyed surgery programs in the United States and Canada use only non-animal training and simulators for surgical training. Like only 20% still use animals. Harvard Medical School, Stanford, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, and the University of Wisconsin, none of them use animals to train surgeons. 223 general surgery programs in the US do not use animals. He also mentioned Elon Musk's company, Neuralink. They had complaints against them about cruel and deadly experiments on live animals, monkeys. And he mentions Musk in here. The SEC investigating false and misleading posts in which Musk claimed no monkey has died as a result of Neuralink implants. They're experimenting with implants in brains. Documents from the University of California, Davis, where Neuralink conducted monkey experiments from 2017 to 2020, revealed that the implantation of the company's devices caused debilitating health effects in monkeys, resulting in euthanasia. About 12 of them were killed. So this is a petition to the Harvard College of Wisconsin. I urge you to modernize and humanize medical training at the Medical College of Wisconsin by ending the use of live animals in general surgery residency programs. There are numerous simulation methods that allow trainees to repeat procedures and hone their skills without harming animals. So you get the gist of his concern and this organization's concern. I subscribe to them, and I certainly support their work. We go from them to Born Free. And Born Free was founded by Angela Grimes. And it has to do with traps and trapping animals that you could say results in torture and needless death. These refuges are home to hundreds of endangered species, parks he's talking about. They host millions of visitors and pets every year and are meant to be a haven for wildlife. Yet body-gripping traps, snares, and steel jaw leg hold traps are permitted on 11 million acres of land within the National Wildlife Refuge. She's very concerned about especially animals that are trapped, and it's a day or two until they're found, and oftentimes they're dead by then. So we have these two organizations that are sort of new for me. And I think we talk about progress quite a bit in this country. And the progress that we're interested in, I think more than the progress of Apple and the latest iPhone and the latest iMac, is progress having to do with our hearts and love in our hearts and concern for living creatures other than people, especially those that have no voice and cannot defend themselves, cannot speak for themselves. I remember Dalai Lama one time talking about religion. And he said, well, my religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. And I thought, yes, that's mine too. And I think what we're looking at here is progress. My sense is 100 years ago, organizations like this would not have thrived at all. And today they have many, many, many members. And Don's going to talk about work going on in Nevada that involves kindness towards animals. So that's our progress, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Don Mouldy, Dr. Don Mouldy today. By the way, I met him as a new University of Kansas graduate in 1973 at Nevada Mental Health Institute, and we were both working on a federal grant. He was there, and then I came and joined him, and we seemed to hit it off, and we've both gone our separate ways in our work, but we've kept in contact with each other. And he is a member of the same family that these people belong to, the people interested in humane treatment of animals. Don is a former member of the Defender of Wildlife, Nevada Humane Society, Nevadans for Responsible Wildlife Management, and the Mountain Lion Association. I've learned so much from talking with you, Don, and from attending some of your meetings. One that stands out for me was his description of coyote contests in Nevada. Actually, coyote killing contests. And I remember the photograph he had of a bar, obviously in a rural area with a big parking lot next to it, totally filled with the bodies of dead coyotes, probably 200 or 300. And this was I guess the final ceremony of that contest. I'm not sure who won it, but that's been an interest of mine ever since then, and I know of Don's. So he's also the co-founder of Nevada Wildlife Alliance, and he's here to talk about wildlife management in Nevada. So with that background, Don, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm glad to be here. It's a big topic, wildlife management, and we may need some more sessions later. There's so much to talk about, but let me start with a story. Speaking of the 70s, when we met, about 1975, there was a photograph in one of the two Reno newspapers. But yes, Reno had two newspapers back in the 70s.
Right.
And this photograph was of a dead mountain lion draped sideways over the hood of a car. The guy that had killed it was standing in front of the car holding his gun, butt on the ground, hand on the barrel, as though he had done something grand. And the caption under the photograph was something like, one of only 39 mountain lions left in Nevada.
Huh.
Up to that point, I'd been an outdoors person, backpacker, but I never thought much about wildlife management or advocacy until I saw that photograph. And that just infuriated me. So I clipped it out, called around, found out who's in charge of mountain lions. At that time, it was the Nevada Department of Fish and Game. They subsequently changed their name, as we'll get to in a minute. So I went over there, sort of barged into a meeting, not knowing how you do things. And then, they said, who are you? And I said, I'm so-and-so. And I held up this photograph of this dead lion on the car. And indicated my opinion that I didn't think much of it, that something was wrong here. I was immediately reassured that the caption was incorrect. There were actually 750 mountain lions in Nevada. So, of course, I inquired, how did they know that? And the answer stunned me. They said, well, a mountain lion hunter told us that.
Someone, you
And,
say.
at that point, a light bulb kind of went off. And it occurred to me that something is perhaps deadly wrong here, literally. So I inquired as to how the mountain lion hunter knew about this, these numbers. And here's what they told me, and this is true. The mountain lion hunter was a rather famous, outdoors person here and lived in Gardnerville. His family was politically prominent. He had a bunch of dogs and he would run mountain lions, just for dog exercise along the Sierra front. So he personally knew of 25 or 30 mountain lions in the Gardnerville, Reno area that he would regularly run with his dogs. And on top of that, they brought him to the department one day and sat him down and gave him some topog maps, elevation contour maps of the state. Asked him to make an X everywhere he thought the contours of the elevation contours were consistent with where a mountain lion could live.
Huh.
So he made X's on the topog maps, counted up the X's, added on his 30 lions that he personally knew about, and presto, the state has 750 mountain lions. That is literally a true story. And sadly, in certain respects, that story is not much different today in some respects. And we may or may not get to some of that. But what I thought today I would do is to remind everybody, well, most people like the idea of wildlife. Public polling shows that clearly. And most people, I think, don't know much about what goes on behind the scenes or how wildlife is managed. And in our case, most wildlife is managed by the state, not by the feds. We've all heard, of course, of the Endangered Species Act, maybe the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and so on. Those are federal laws, the Migratory Bird Act, and so on. But basically, wildlife management, 90% of it or whatever, is done by the states. And in this state, all states have a fish and wildlife department. We have the Nevada Department of Wildlife, formerly known as the Nevada Fish and Game Department when I first came here. And to some extent, maybe that name still kind of lingers. But the Department of Wildlife itself is a state agency. It has employees like all other state agencies, the Highway Department, the Welfare Department, the Mental Health Department. They're all people hired on the basis of their training and expertise and application and so on. And by and large, in my opinion, the Department of Wildlife does many, many good things that the public never hears about. They run a fisheries operation. They have biologists and others that comment on land use plans. For example, if a mining company is going to open up or a pipeline is coming through, that sort of thing. There's a law enforcement division that does good things. There are fiscal people and statistical. Well, a lot of good stuff is done. So I have a high regard for the Department of Wildlife itself. But there's another component to the Department of Wildlife that, in my view, is more problematic, and I'll mention that in a minute. That's called the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners. And the Wildlife Commission is a politically appointed body of 9 persons that basically sits on top of the Department of Wildlife, has rulemaking authority, the commission does. Also, my money has veto authority over what the department does. So this politically appointed 9-person commission appointed by the governor without any Senate confirmation in the state, as is the case in many other states. This 9-member person pretty much runs things. And by law, by statute, according to what the legislature has said, 5 of the 9 commissioners are licensees. That is, in order to hold that seat, the person needs to have had a hunting, fishing, or trapping license 3 out of the last 4 years. That's a requirement to be in those seats. So 5 of the 9 are licensees, and generally they're always hunters. Once in a while, a trapper, perhaps. A 6th seat is reserved for a rancher, always a Hunter sympathizer. The 7th seat for a farmer, always a Hunter sympathizer. The 8th seat is called the conservationist seat. And generally that has been filled by, most frequently over the years, members of the Audubon Society, bird watchers. David McNinch is currently the conservationist person, who's been in that seat for 20 years or so. And certainly has a good understanding of conservation issues. And then the final seat is the general public seat. And in the past, it has contained members of the public who were not licensees necessarily. Currently, the general public seat is filled by a fur trapper from Eastern Nevada. So of the 9 commissioners, 8 of them are hunters or trappers or sympathizers. Well, they're all licensed, 8 of them not. Now, that presents a real problem for people on our side who are interested in non-consumptive use of wildlife, that it's wildlife to be observed and photographed and appreciated for its existence. And when our side goes to the commission with a legitimate issue, as we did recently, where we were asking the commission to create some trapping regulations that would protect mountain lions from inadvertent or accidental trapping by fur trappers, bobcat trappers primarily. And we had lots of data and photographs and so on to support our requests, all of which came from the Department of Wildlife itself. We knew before the day started, before we even walked in the door, that we would have 8 votes against us, even before we made our presentation. But we did it anyway, because in order to use that issue later, let's say at the legislature, when we're asking for some change in the commission construction, then we need to tell the legislature that we have been to the agency and tried to work with the agency, and this has been the result. So one of the big issues that I wanted to be clear about with everybody is that, and each year that passes, as public attitudes change about wildlife and what they appreciate about it, each year that the public evolves, the Wildlife Commission structure in this state, and by the way, this is not unique, it's common around the West. This structure is not democratic by any stretch of the imagination. It's highly user dominated. It would be sort of like the loggers being in charge of the Forest Service, the miners being in charge of all the mining, and the ranchers being in charge of the grazing on public lands. This is an example of where licensees are in charge of wildlife. And we know from public polling in this state that about 20% of the public in Nevada would regard themselves as a licensee, or the word that's used as a traditionalist. Animals are simply objects to be used for human purpose. About 44% of the state are mutualists, according to the terminology that pollsters use. And that would include me, and I'm sure us in the room here. Then there's another 20% that can be either, depending on the circumstances. And then about 15% of the public who just doesn't care about wildlife or anything else. So interestingly, Nevada is the second highest mutualist state in the country, second only to California, which has about 48% mutualists as compared to our 44. So from the point of view of public polling, the Wildlife Commission is desperately undemocratic, and in our opinion, a major problem, and needs to be modified in terms of how it's constructed and what happens. That's a job for the legislature, and it's kind of a work in progress, and we're working on that. Given the time constraints, I think I'm going to move to the issue of wild horses briefly, although wild horses are not traditionally regarded as wildlife, and I don't regard wild horses as wildlife either, for that matter. But the issue of wild horses always comes up at Wildlife Commission meetings when wildlife matters are discussed. And in my opinion, there's a lot of misinformation about wild horses in Nevada, and so I'd like to just present some numbers that any of you can Google yourself. With respect to the number of wild horses in Nevada, the last estimate that I checked a day or two ago was the 2024 BLM estimate of about 33,000 horses and change in Nevada, and about 4,500 burros. Now, the interesting thing about wild horses in Nevada has more wild horses than any other state. Wild horses basically pretty much live on BLM land in Nevada. Now, in Nevada, the BLM manages 48 million acres. That's the amount of land the BLM manages in Nevada. Of that 48 million, wild horses live on 15 million acres. So wild horses live on about a third of the land that BLM manages in this state. So even if wild horses were totally removed from Nevada, which some people sort of advocate or severely reduced, that would only affect 1/3 of Nevada's BLM lands, many of which are not in good condition because of decades of overgrazing by livestock. So wild horses, their removal or severe reduction in numbers would not affect 2/3 of BLM land in Nevada. Wild horses don't live on public lands by themselves. There are two other major animal groups that live there. One is wildlife, and the big four ungulate species in Nevada that also live on public lands: deer, elk, pronghorn, antelope, and bighorn. Live on public lands and have impacts on public lands. And if we just do the numbers, deer numbers in Nevada are currently around 70,000. Elk numbers 12 or 13,000. Bighorn sheep around 10. Antelope or pronghorns about 30,000. So if you add up those four species groups, that comes out to around 120, 25,000 compared to 33,000 wild horses, just as a comparison. Then we have domestic livestock. And according to the National Agricultural Statistics Survey, Nevada has somewhere north of 400,000 domestic cattle, not including dairy cattle. And of those 400,000, it's uncertain because the numbers aren't easily available, how many use public land. But I think it's a conservative estimate that at least 300,000 domestic cows use public lands for some portion of the year.
That would be BLM.
Yeah, BLM, another 300,000 cows, and then consistently about 60,000 domestic sheep. So if you add up domestic livestock, that is cows and sheep, and if you add up, include then the ungulates, that is the deer, elk, pronghorn, bighorn, we're talking about 33,000 horses and about 500,000 other animals, the wildlife ungulate species and the domestic livestock issue. So when the wild horse issue comes up as to what the horses do or don't do to public lands and what's needed with respect to management, I think it's always useful to keep in mind the compared to what question. And the compared to what question is that wild horses are outnumbered about 10 or 12, 14 to 1 by wildlife species and domestic livestock. And those are simply numbers. Now, our opinion about it, what it means, you know, is something we can talk about later. One other thing I wanted to briefly talk about, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because it sounds like we should have some on Zoom. One of the, well, how would you say this? 100 years ago, when it became clear that wildlife needed to be managed because wildlife species were being decimated by overhunting. The legislators, I guess, as is their inclination, had what they thought was a brilliant idea. Let's manage wildlife and let's make the people who want to kill wildlife pay for it. Let's have a user fee system. So if you want to hunt wildlife, you want to kill wildlife, and we have to have a management system, we'll charge you a license fee. And whatever. And then we will use that money to pay for management, and we won't have to use any of our general fund monies for this. It's a win-win. And so that's the way funding got started. And it probably worked well for a long time, although one of the side effects of that is it created a sense of entitlement among the users who thought, well, if we're paying for it, then we get to say, and why shouldn't we? And so as time went on, up to the present, and as interest in hunting declined, as it has every year for the last number of years, and as revenue dropped off, and as the public became more interested in wildlife, we now have a kind of a conflict where our agencies are stuck, their hunting revenue is declining, the public is asking for more non-lethal services, and now when you go to a wildlife commission meeting, as I mentioned earlier, 8 of the 9 seats are hunters or hunter sympathizers, but they're running out of money in a sense, needing more public support, but they don't want to give ground on what they regard as their territory. And sometimes you sort of get the feeling, they're sort of saying, why are you here? This is our business you're sticking your nose into. Why don't we just go do some bird watching or something? I'm kind of exaggerating here, but the sense of entitlement and ownership that has been created over the decades by user pay is now a real issue. And the Department of Wildlife currently has a budget of about $60 million a year. Of that, hunters and licensees, fishermen, hunters, trappers, and their tag fees and so on contribute about 1/3 of the agency's budget. Another third comes from federal excise taxes on guns, ammunition, archery equipment, and also fishing equipment. These are federal excise taxes that are rebated to the states depending on according to a certain formula, where basically it depends on the geographic size of the state and the number of hunting licenses that are sold in the state. Nevada gets about 1/3 of its budget from these excise taxes. And a number of studies, including one that my partner Mark Smith and I did shows that of the federal excise dollars that come in, only about 15 or 20% of the federal excise dollars actually come from hunting. The extra 80% or so come from gun nuts and people going to shooting ranges, and gun collectors, and people like me who used to go out and shoot tin cans and things of that sort. So that the excise taxes account for about a third of the budget. And then the remaining third comes from a hodgepodge of things. Offshore oil and gas leasing is one place. Mitigation monies from mining companies for tearing up the landscape, pipeline mitigation monies. There was a green initiative in Nevada 30 or 40 years ago that contributed many millions of dollars to the department by a ballot measure that was passed and so on. So hunters like to tell people that they pay for wildlife. But in truth, their license fees and tag sales and so on accounts for about a third, and the other 2/3, not so much from them. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop and see if we have some questions, and then I have one other thing I can talk about if I need to, depending on the interest online. Can we do that?
Sure.
So
we'll see if we have questions here and then
okay.
go to Zoom. As far as the democratic composition of the Wildlife Commission, 8-1 you were talking about, what are the ways that could be remedied? To get more of the middle people that use both that you were describing.
Yeah, good question, and one we don't have a really good answer for. There's no need for a wildlife commission, for one. It's not necessary. The department could do everything itself. We could swap out a couple of hunters for a couple of non-hunters. Add an indigenous person, for example, or maybe eliminate all requirements and simply let the governor pick the best people he or she thinks might fit, depending on credentials and how they present themselves and so on. There could be any number of options. There is no one single best choice right now that I'm aware of, but clearly something needs to be done over time. Another option, by the way, would be to have appointees by the governor approved by the Senate, which sort of like our national thing happens, or cabinet members are appointed by and approved by the Senate and so on. Many states have that for their wildlife commissions, but we don't. That would be another option.
Do we have any questions here? Anybody?
I know, like on Thursday nights on PBS, this rancher show comes up,
Yes,
and it's totally one side perspective.
true.
And I don't know how that comes up, why that particular gets aired and not any other side.
Well, I think the program is called, I forgot the name, I just looked at it the other day. Yeah, it presents the rancher's point of view, and there is a point of view. You know, they have leases to graze on public lands, and they're part of the land management scheme that BLM, gets into. Wildlife does depend on private land.
They say they promote wildlife and increase it, but.
Well, it depends on what they mean by wildlife. They certainly promote deer and elk, although they complain about elk eating their hay stacks and so on. They're not friendly to mountain lions. They're not friendly to coyotes. They're not friendly to blackbirds. They're not friendly to a number of other things. So when they use the word wildlife, it would be nice sometimes to hear them define, the species they are concerned about and those they aren't. Because, no, that's not all ranchers, I hate to paint with a broad brush.
Yeah.
There are certainly some good, decent ranchers, and I've known some, over the years. But generally, ranching is not sympathetic to coyotes and mountain lions, and those are two animals that I think highly of, so we have a conflict.
Leah, do you have any questions from your end?
There are several questions here on Zoom. I will start from the top from Nancy Ann. Is there a bill in this year's legislature to change the composition of the Wildlife Commission? It seems almost a majority of Nevada residents are against coyote hunts, yet there's only one representative of the public on the board.
Well, again, a great question, and the answer is no, there's no bill currently. Here's the, how close we came. If Governor Sisolak had been reelected, a couple of years ago, there probably would have been a bill in this legislature, reshaping the commission in some fashion, because he understood, clearly the undemocratic nature of the commission, and most of the legislators do as well. But Governor Sisolak, in our opinion, would not be sympathetic to such a bill, particularly since it's my understanding that he believes that the rural communities basically got him elected.
On board.
And so he would be not inclined to change a balance in such a way that coyotes and mountain lions would get a break, for example. So no, nothing pending, but it's, you know, it's a work in progress, and a number of us in the state are working on it. And so sooner or later, we're gonna have one, but none now.
Well, and I think along that vein, what is the relationship between a county wildlife commission and a state commission? That question again from Nancy Ann.
Yeah, it's a good one. Each county has what's called a county advisory board for wildlife, abbreviated as CAB, C-A-B. And these are little county commissions, like the Washoe County Commission. All counties have these things. And they're advisory boards, and the county commission appoints the members, usually 3 or 4 members, 5 here in county, in Washoe County. They're like little Pee-wee wildlife commissions, if you will. And they meet before the wildlife commission meets. They usually get the agenda, what's on the agenda, and then supposedly they hold their meeting and sample public opinion, and then render and then send one of their members to the commission meeting itself to report on what happened. But practically, several of the CABs never meet. Some haven't met in years. Others are active, like the Clark County CAB or the Washoe County CAB to some extent. But most of the time, the public knows nothing about them, or if the public goes, that is people who are not consumptive or, you know, hunters or whatnot. They're not greeted friendly. They don't get a friendly welcome, and they generally don't go back. So the CABs are kind of useless. They're there because they're in law. And I think any bill that would remodel the Wildlife Commission would also have to take a look at CABs. Because probably they're not worth the money that are spent on them now. They don't truly represent the public in any fashion.
Thank you.
Leah, any more?
Yes, another question is, do ranchers pay per head of domestic stock allowed to graze public lands? Isn't that number available in order to compute the number of domestic animals grazing public lands?
Yes, yes, ranchers pay $1.35 a month.
Some do.
Well, theoretically, but that's the current rate. $1.35 a month for one cow, or one cow and one calf, or 5 sheep. So that's what they pay. But the BLM is very coy about providing any information to allow a calculation as to how many domestic livestock actually use public lands. And the National Agricultural Statistical Service is also coy about that. The best way of calculating it is to use the number of ALMs that are appropriated for livestock, which in some years approaches 2 million, I think, and then kind of work backwards as to, it's been a while ago since I did this calculation. But my best guess is at least 300,000 domestic cattle or cows and calves or sheep use public lands. Well, sheep, we're talking cows. That's as close as I could come. Now, why these numbers are hard to come by is anybody's guess. My guess is that it's just not a number that they're interested in the public, easily having available for various reasons. So anyway, that's the best I can give you on that one.
I have another, Leah, we have one question here for me. Have you made any, I think the commission meeting that I attended with you a few months ago now, you and your group were proposing to change the coyote killing contest, right? And my impression was that a lot of people were making, was it about trapping? I'm not sure. But they were making the argument that this was painful, like for animals and mistreatment. And those kind of arguments were not carrying the day with the commission. They weren't sensitive to how animals were being hurt. I think this must have been trapping we talked about.
Well, we're talking about two issues: coyote killing contests, which is one, trapping, totally, that was the mountain lion issue. And coyote killing contests are an embarrassment for this state. The first time we tried to get the Wildlife Commission to do something about killing contests was 10 years ago. We had a petition, had close to 100 people show up, most of which were in support of our position, to get rid of them. Commission deferred, tried to establish a policy instead, which never went anywhere. And then I've had another 2 or 3 chances since then, including one that's currently pending. But the commission refuses to take the proper action, even though the public overwhelmingly opposes these issues. And, the reasons are political and personal and so on. And basically, they don't like coyotes. And the rural communities don't like coyotes.
And rural community, it's a revenue source for rural.
Well, yeah, a little bit, and if these guys ban coyote killing contests, then the commissioners that live in rural areas will have to answer for that at the gas station, the convenience store, at the bar, and their people will complain to them and blah, blah. And so they've chosen at this point to maybe think about regulating it in some fashion, and that's coming up in May at their next meeting. With respect to trapping, no. Well, with respect to animals suffering, everything that pertains to wildlife management in Nevada is exempt from animal cruelty statutes. All of the animal cruelty statutes in the state that apply to anything, anywhere, none of that applies to wildlife for obvious reasons. So it's pointless to go to a Wildlife Commission meeting and claim that trapping is cruel or that it's painful. Everybody knows that. And they just kind of, yawn and look at you like, move on, what's the next thing you've got to say? So the cruelty argument gets nowhere. And the lion petition thing that we presented that you were at, talk about grotesque photographs and so on that we showed the commission, turns anybody's stomach. But yet they, as you said, disregarded them. And that brings up an interesting point about the Wildlife Commission. It's my understanding, according to law, and I think there is some federal law on this, is that a regulatory agency, like the Department of Wildlife or Wildlife Commission, the regulatory agencies are supposed to make decisions based on evidence, based on testimony, based on something factual. That's the job of a regulatory agency. They're not discretionary. They can't just opt out of the evidence. Well, that's the theory, but clearly we see time and time again, and we saw in that meeting, the Wildlife Commission did not decide not to honor our petition because we didn't present any evidence. Our evidence was overwhelming compared to the emotionally charged complaints from the other side, you know, that they had a constitutional right to kill whatever it was. So the Wildlife Commission, in my view, doesn't do its job because it disregards evidence in things that we're interested in, including killing contests. The Humane Society of the US, now renamed, made brilliant presentations to on four different occasions regarding killing contests. I've never seen better presentation of data, photographs, polling data, and so on. None of that mattered. So the Wildlife Commission doesn't make its decisions based on evidence in these cases. They make their decision based on emotion. And, you know, anecdotal complaints.
And emotions of who?
The other side.
The other side.
Their side. That's the emotion they pay attention to, not the evidence.
So that comes down to he said, she said, back and forth. 50,
Look here, look there, look up there.
yeah.
So anything else on the Zoom?
Oh,
Yes,
Mhm.
there are several questions on Zoom. So there is one here from Robin that says, regarding ranchers paying for grazing rights, who assesses whether ranchers do pay and their numbers are accurate?
Well, that's the BLM's job, I guess, and how. I don't, you know, I don't know the answer to that directly, but it's the BLM. You know, they manage grazing on public land, and they know, you know, who's got allotments and how many cows they're supposed to have out. And there is a certain amount of oversight. I don't think the BLM is slack on this. The grand exception to that would be the, you know, the, what's his name down in Gold Butte, you know, I've forgotten his name at the moment, it'll come to me. The guy who sort of thumbed his nose at the BLM for years and years and runs his cows down there. There was that
Oh,
big.
Bundy?
Yeah, Bundy, the Bundy guy, you know, now it appears that he's not paid or certainly hasn't removed his cows, and I have no good explanation, and I have never seen a good explanation as to why he's gotten a pass. But
They
as far
tried,
as,
they tried to take his cattle and all these people show up with
well,
guns.
they didn't want to have a big shootout. But as far as I know, that's sort of the grand example. I don't think that ranchers are deliberately stiffing the BLM, you know, on grand scale. I don't really think so, but the BLM would know, you know, I don't know.
Board, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you thought the wildlife department could handle. They do handle the licensing right now, is that right?
Yeah, the Department of Wildlife, sure, it does all the licensing stuff and so on. But what the legislature doesn't like is that if the commission went away, to the extent that the commission does stuff, the department doesn't, the legislature might have to do it. The legislature doesn't want to do any more than it's doing now.
Yeah.
So if it gets rid of a body that has regulatory authority, we don't want to do anything. So everything that the commission does would have to somehow be transported into the department, blah, blah. Actually, a lot of what the commission does can be done on the computer with software, setting season lengths and all this stuff. Anyway, that's the legislators' dread about getting rid of a commission, that it would lead to more work for them. And the legislature, no matter what you think of them, they don't want to run state agencies. That is not why they're there. They're not interested in that.
And they're worried they would if they got rid of their commissioner.
Could be a side effect.
And if they have a vote going one way, people will get mad.
Well, we got a couple minutes yet.
Leah, any more?
There are a few, one other one on here. Does the Department of Wildlife have responsibility to provide watering troughs for wild horses and other animals?
No, the Department of Wildlife has no responsibility for wild horses. No, that's. Well, no, and briefly, the BLM has responsibility for wild horses in our local areas south of Highway 50. 40 years ago, the BLM decided that the wild horses north of Highway 50, Dayton, Silver Springs, Fernley, and so on, are not wild horses according to the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 71. So those horses are the responsibility of the State Department of Agriculture. And they don't manage horses, so they contract with volunteer groups. And most of the water that's provided for the wild horses north of Highway 50 out at the Tahoe Regional Industrial Complex are provided by the companies that live out there. Walmart and Tesla and so on generally have water available for horses on the perimeter of their property. But the Department of Wildlife has no responsibility for wild horses. Now, when they put out a guzzler, that raises an ethical question. When they put out a guzzler and the guzzler has water in it because of adequate rain and snow, and attracts bighorns or other wildlife to the guzzler where it otherwise wouldn't be because there's no water there. In dry years, when the guzzler goes dry, then what ethical responsibility does the department have to go put water in those guzzlers that they put there in the beginning, hoping Mother Nature would keep them full, but Mother Nature doesn't. So that's an interesting ethical conundrum that floats around the department once in a while. But anyway, looks like we're out of time.
Just about. Leah, we're running on 10 o'clock here. Any last minute
Yes,
question?
well, just one last thing, if you don't mind, if you could provide the reference for the petition to replace for non-animal use in medical schools, that was requested as well, the petition to replace animal use in medical schools.
That
Thank
was a
you so
PCR,
much.
PCRM.
Yeah, I can provide whatever you want on that.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. There is a question, what is the issue for the May Commission meeting? I don't know if you can answer that one quickly for us.
Oh, sure. Well, the big issue for the Bay Commission meeting are the quotas for the hunts, the deer, bighorn, pronghorn, and elk. That's the big issue, but the killing contest is going to reappear on the May issue, and the department has been asked to provide the commission for verbiage that they can look at that would create a season, some sort of a license thing or whatnot, and what the department would have to do to regulate killing contests. That is not a very palatable option for many people, but that will be on the Wildlife Commission's agenda for May.
Okay. Well, thank you, Don, so much for coming. Let's give Don a hand. And Leah, thank you for helping coordinate this.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us in this hybrid session. Yeah, we've got 10 folks listening online. So you had quite a crowd up here.
Yeah, sometime we'll do a question and answer thing. We could just, I think that's kind of fun. There are always lots of questions about wildlife. We could just do one of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Okey doke.